teleconference hosted by the Traceability and Data Exchange Architecture Working Group, which has drafted a white paper on this issue for us to discuss today. And just a few housekeeping matters. If you've not already done so, please enter your audio PIN so we can make sure we are all able to hear you. And you can do that by pressing pound and then the audio PIN number, which should be on the panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and then pound again. And we would like to let you know that today's presentation is going to be recorded. All right, and then also, as another housekeeping matter, you can submit questions in the questions panel, which is also on the right-hand side of your screen. And what you can do is just click the little hand button that you see in front of you, and that will raise your hand for which we can unmute you for questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Rob Welsh, who will introduce us here.
Thank you, Krista. And my name's Rob Welsh. I'm currently co-chair of the overall Supply Chain Security Steering Committee of Rx-360, and I'm with VWR International in a role of Vice President of Category Management, focused in the area of production chemical operations. I co-chair the group with Joe Newell. He's Executive Director of Operations, Strategic Planning, Risk Management, and overall project management at Amgen. So my role is really to introduce, kind of provide some context, and then to introduce the speakers who will touch base on this issue. And it really, you know, I just want to ground everyone around what the objective of this overall Supply Chain Steering Committee in support of Rx-360's mission of patient safety, and it's to develop and share best practices and information on key supply chain security processes and enhance collaboration among supply chain stakeholders on issues of supply chain security. So with that, if you move to the next slide, Krista, just to provide context, this traceability data exchange architecture work group was chartered back and formed back in July of 2014, and it was really to address, you know, the issue of, you know, conceptual models for the interoperable sharing and exchange of data associated and required by global traceability regulations. And that was focused, and they've just published the white paper, and then today we'll talk you through the content of their efforts. And consistent with these work groups, you know, the intent with these work groups is to form these groups and then come out within a year with a deliverable that will be usable and for industry and as an outcome. So they've done a terrific job. I just show on the screen some of the other areas of work streams in terms of just to provide some context of other areas of focus that are under the supply chain security area for Rx-360, whether it be cargo theft. There's an active work group on upstream supply chain security. There's been a number of conferences and meetings held in Africa and supporting GDP. And also the content of these work papers has been used in conjunction with supporting important things such as APEC meetings and workshops going forward. So with that, you know, I want to congratulate and thank for the contribution of the co-chairs who will speak through this, and they are Peggy Staver. She's Director of Product Integrity at Pfizer. Lloyd Mager, he's Manager Strategic Initiatives of Supply Chain Operations at AbbVie. And then Brian Rezek, who's a partner with Omni Media Associates and working on this as a consultant representing activists. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brian, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank everyone here for their interest in our work group and its activities, and for attending this morning's webinar. Additional thanks go out to the Rx-360 organization, and of course to Peggy Staver and Lloyd Mager for all of their work on this, as well as Anne-Marie Pollack and Mike Zupek for their writing contributions, and all of the participants in our TDEA teleconferences, as well as the voluntary reviewers who looked at earlier versions of this white paper and helped it get to the final status that you'll see when you download it. The TDA white paper wasn't written only by this small group. What we've really done here is to organize and to document, and in some cases augment, the discussions that we had on the TDA calls over several months. And hopefully the final product has accurately reported these comments and perspectives and meets the stated goals of the work group. So looking at the slide that you have in front of you, this is kind of where we started. The work group began last summer of 2014, with these objectives. So to recap, we were trying to advance the dialogue around serialized data exchange and data architecture models. So we were not really addressing lot-level data exchange. We were really looking for the unit serialized models. We were looking to encourage input, certainly, from all industry stakeholders, and I believe we succeeded in that. We were to establish a common understanding of existing models that we're developing in countries around the world. And we were trying to determine if consensus views exist and if harmonization of models may be possible. And on harmonization, as opposed to harmonizing an entire model archetype, as the work group's activities went on, we chose to look at model characteristics individually, which Peggy will speak about a little later on, for the purpose of identifying perhaps common elements for potential harmonization among requirements. We were also seeking to assess the need for additional pilots and proof of concept work, and as well as identifying desired aspects of those pilots and the POC work. And this white paper documents the work group comments through all of those meetings on all of those topics. So if we could go to the next slide, Krista, please. So this white paper, on this white paper, our stated goal from the start really was to level set, or at least provide a common platform for some very important industry discussions that hopefully will take place around model characteristics. So as you can see here, we are going to, the goals of the white paper were to delineate choreography types and other considerations, to establish a common understanding of the various models that exist and that are pending, to document the merits, and I would describe those as the pros and cons, depending on your perspective, of the various models as seen by the work group participants, and discuss, as I mentioned, the harmonization opportunities, or perhaps to define a hybrid approach to be assessed. We were also seeking to advance the work effort required in order to make decisions regarding the desired choreography for future mandates, both here in the United States as well as in other markets. And in terms of advancing the work effort, as we mentioned, we view the paper as a starting point for discussion and proof of concept work, hopefully leading to an eventual consensus around choreography and related issues. So if you could go forward, Krista, please. Our approach from the start was to delineate choreography from serialization, which is the purview of GS1 and others. So on choreography, we began with the four pertinent questions. Where does the data reside? How does the data move? Who owns and manages the data? And who has access to the data? Ultimately, through these industry conversations, a balance will need to be found between functionality, easy access, management of ownership rights, and of course, network security. In other words, trying to keep the bad actors out of the system. If you could go forward, Krista. Early on, we had a series of presentations made by participants in the work group on the various markets. The intention here was to illustrate the differences in choreography among this collection of some of the more defined international requirements. In the white paper, for ease of comparison, we've set these up in template form. So the information fields covered are mandate status, serialization, key implementation dates, supply chain data, data repositories, and then funding and government issues. And our presenters covered the markets Brazil, China, the United States, the European Union, Turkey, South Korea, and Argentina. And once again, thank you to all of those who presented on these models. At this point, Krista, if you'd advance the slide, I'll turn it over to Lloyd, who will get into some detail now on model archetypes on storage and choreography.
Thank you, Brian. Well, when we started the effort, we were talking about data storage predominantly is one of the key questions. Where does the data reside? And then that led to these topics that Brian just spoke of, the fundamental model aspects. What is the data that's needed? Where does the data reside? What is the data choreography? And as these boiled down, the data that's needed is, we've had these topics in multiple different forums, and it came back to these main elements: the master data, which is typically static data related to product or location; transaction data, that's about what has been purchased and exchanged between trading partners; and event data, which is the new data type that we're all dealing with, which is specifically associated to a physical capture of a product and relates to, for instance, the ones that are easily known, ship and receive, or many other types. And then that kind of led to the fact of, well, once we have this data, we know which data we're dealing with. Where do we put this data so that some sense can be made out of this data? What is the, how do you get a report out of this information? It has to be logically organized. And the storage location, again, boiled down to very similar discussions as in the past. Is this a centralized database, semi-centralized, or distributed? And there's some following slides that will get into these from a definition perspective. And the paper covers this completely. But the key thing that really kept coming out that we wanted to understand and discuss was choreography. And this is, in essence, the process. It's the sequence of steps and movements needed to operate the model. And we need to have a defined process for this. Any model for a specific country will need this. They may have some variation from country to country, as we found and we know, but it's all about the process. General discussion about these aspects highlighted many topics, but the ones that seemed to pop out were cost, data rights, and ownership. These were key elements that are continued to be reflected in the paper and should be part of any work going forward. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to quickly talk about the three different model types that are represented in the paper. And these model types, there's a lot of work that is being done in GS1, and we used the GS1 basis of information to reflect the graphics in the paper. The centralized model is one that I think everybody conceptually understands and gets. It's basically, what is the one central place I put all the data that is going to allow me to get a report out of it to explain what it is I'm trying to explain. And there are many different models that are out there, and we didn't go as far as to start labeling which country is with which one, because there could be perceived differences in this. But I think when we think historically, the first country that put a database structure in place was Turkey, and we look at that and we say this is a centralized database. And our speaker that presented on that regional database explained that this is really a set of two databases, and you have events in Turkey for what is being authenticated in one database, and events for that which is aggregated in another database. So even though they're both centralized events, they were based on certain event types, and so it could be considered a hybrid. So with that being said, even a central database may not be as straightforward, and that's why we didn't go into the detail in the paper to try to label any one country with a certain type. Next slide, please. Then we get into a semi-central model archetype, and the key thing with the semi-central model is that this one's a little bit different in that it's not all the events for a report are in one place. Basically, it's by product. For a particular G10, every G10 would have a nominated repository in which all the data, all the events that were created would be moved to that repository so you could pull out a report. And this is a definition that is well accepted and worked into the model work that has been done in different work groups by multiple organizations. So that's a key distinction between that and the centralized database. Next slide, please. Now you get into the distributed model archetype, and the distributed model archetype basically says there's going to be data that's created by multiple entities, and rather than moving the data to any central or semi-central location, the data is kept in a repository that the company keeps its records in, and the reporting will later on have to pull these data elements out of the disparate repositories to create the report. So these are the three model archetypes that were defined, and we did not define any others, but it should just be realized that you could come up with a hybrid of these different types, and I think there's a lot of different variations as the choreography is discussed that could lead you to utilize these in different ways. Next slide, please. Which brings us to the data choreography. And the choreography is all being achieved for a purpose. We know that there are some markets that says I want to be able to verify before I dispense, and other markets that says I want to be able to understand what happened throughout the supply chain. And it's very important when you look at it from this perspective. So at a high level, and again, thank you to GS1 for the graphics and part of bodies of work that occurred, you're looking to secure your supply chain in one way or another. And it really boils down to, on one side, can I verify that this object is the right object? Can I identify it? Can it be verified that this thing that I am handling is something that is legitimate in the supply chain? On the other side is typically what's been referred to pedigree or traceability. Is there an ability to track forward where this is at, or trace back where this has come from, and put together a picture of this so that I am assured that this is a secure supply chain? And depending on the geographic location or the trade partners working on specific products to be put out there, you could utilize one or the other or both of these techniques to come up with a secure supply chain picture. So the data choreography gets very complicated depending on all the different events that have to be managed and handled, and who moves data where. And again, it all boils down to this picture of having a safe and secure supply chain by one of two methods: authentication, verification, or traceability, pedigree type activities. Next slide, please. So you start to get into the work that's been done, and GS1 has a triad that is always spoken to: identify, capture, and share. And that's reflected in this graphic, which is a GS1 graphic as well. GS1 has done a lot of work, a lot of members, a lot of people on this listening to this have been involved with GS1. And as we have worked to make sure that we identify our products in a uniform way for efficiency purposes, we've also done the same thing to make sure we capture our products in a uniform way. And we've coalesced around certain things such as G10 and data carrier, the 2D data matrix, for those purposes. When it comes to the share aspect of it, we have the same effort in front of us, and you can see that there's the master data, transactional data, event data elements that are shown. And we have to find the ability to share data, and it's going to get into not only the location, the storage of where data is, but the choreography. So it's a very important concept to understand as we look at our processes and we try to build those processes according to our objectives we want to meet, whether it's authentication or traceability. Next slide, please. So in summary, for the whole section of the paper, which is dealing with the data storage and choreography, this is, first of all, there was nothing new. We just organized it in a way to reflect from a base level how this should be looked at and discussed going forward. The key things that came out of this is we need stakeholder alignment and agreement going forward. We cannot afford to go into some of these efforts with misaligned ideas. it's a connected supply chain, so it's a connected process. We need to make sure that we understand the objective, what data is needed to meet that objective. We have to understand how it's going to be stored and available for those who have the rights and permissions to access that data. How do we get the data to that location? There's a whole choreography about that, and just the whole permissive piece to it. How do we define the process? Every time a new process goes in place that's impactful to different segments of the supply chain, we need to work this out. And this kind of starts the process of moving forward and understanding that and discussing that. So at this point in time, I believe I'd like to ask Peggy Staber to present the next section of slides.
Thanks, Lloyd. So as Brian mentioned early on, one of the key objectives of this initiative was to advance the industry dialogue, as we say, around this whole topic of data architecture and exchange, so where the data resides and how it moves. And we believe we've just begun that effort through the work that we did with Rx-360 on this work group. There's a lot more yet to be done. But we know that through proactive collaboration across all sectors in the supply chain and a consensus building process, that we can have a lot of influence on the outcome, if you will, or at least we believe that we can. And so we highly value that. And the last section of the paper really just talks about the importance of us coming together, trying to see if we can align on key aspects of models through some work that we'll describe here. It's important for us to understand the priorities and concerns of each of the sectors so that any given model or models address those issues. And we'll talk about timing of proof of concept, that's POC, proof of concept work, and what what characteristics should be tested. How would we evaluate the results of this proof of concept work against each other if we did more than one proof of concept or pilot work? Is there a way that we can test on an appropriate scale some of the issues that we're looking at so that we can determine the operational impact? To this point, much of the work that's been done has been on a small scale, and really as we've now started to deploy solutions in various markets, we know the real value and real learning comes when we move to production and we have larger volumes of product impacting our existing processes. So we're trying to find a way that we can really understand the impact of these various models on our operations and look at whether or not it's possible to conduct more than one industry pilot concurrently. But again, through this work, we hope that the outcome will have some impact on discussions that are taking place in other forums around harmonization or convergence on requirements, if you will. So if we could go to the next slide. So we developed a list of criteria, and this was really just a brainstorming list, if you will, of aspects that we thought would be important for us to assess each of the various models against. So, I won't read each of these. You can see them, and there's a definition for each of these in the white paper. But these are the things that we thought are important. And there may be more, and some may come off of the list. But this is really our starting point for what we think we need to understand and assess relative to each of the models. If you could go to the next slide. So in terms of proof of concept work, one of the things that we did with our Rx-360 work group was to ask all of the participants to help us identify what they all felt still needed to be assessed, or I should say you all felt still needed to be assessed and tested further, if you will. So we had some discussion around aggregation and inference and the impact that providing aggregated information would have, not just from a manufacturer's perspective, but on distributors and dispensers as well. How would they receive the information? What impact would it have on their operations? And what would the impact be if aggregation information was not provided? So looking at both the impact of aggregation or trying to assess, is it possible to do this without aggregation? And as I just mentioned a minute ago, what's the operational impact of serialization on our existing systems and processes, as well as errors and exception handling. So, we've talked a lot about exceptions, and we actually have started to see some exceptions as we've deployed various solutions in a number of markets. So, we believe that there's some additional work that we need to do here to make sure that the models that we're looking at aren't so complex, for example, that the model itself actually introduces or increases the likelihood of errors and exceptions. So this is another area we want to discuss. Again, how the data will move, as we've been talking about, how transaction data versus master data may move. Do we push or pull data? Do we put it out someplace and let people go retrieve data as needed? Those kind of discussions around choreography and architecture. Of course, cost is an important consideration in all of these models, as well as some of the other aspects that Lloyd mentioned around governance and data access and ownership will all be important considerations. And then inventory visibility. This has kind of been the elephant in the room, if you will, in terms of is there some mutual value to increased inventory visibility, similar to what the retail industry has found, that we may eventually find on the pharmaceutical side that might drive us to some added business value from the work that and the investments that we're all making here in serialization. So that's an area that there was some expressed interest in as well. And then a lot of the work that's been done to date has really focused on centralized or distributed models, and there was an interest in understanding more about how the semi-centralized models may work and whether that might be of interest as a potential path forward, and if so, at what cost, and all the issues that we've discussed in terms of characteristics that would need to be assessed. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, we've laid out a path here that we hope will continue this dialogue. And we talked about the Pharmaceutical Distribution Security Alliance, or PDSA group, that is managed by Levitt Partners, helping us to assess the various models using the criteria that we've just discussed to make an initial assessment anyway of each of these models. And then depending on the outcome of that work and identification of certain areas that we feel we need to do some piloting or proof of concept work around, HDMA has agreed to oversee and provide a forum for us to do some industry pilot work. We feel it's important that we begin this effort in the second half of 2015. The assessment by PDSA will take place, I think, around mid-year into maybe the third quarter or so, and perhaps we can advance the work with HDMA beginning later this year. The reason that we feel timing is critical, and a concern that we have, is that people may think that we have a long time, especially if you're focused on the U.S. market, for example, where item-level traceability doesn't kick in until 2023. There may be some false sense that that's a long time off and we don't need to really put a lot of effort on this right now. But our concern is based on what we've seen in terms of the amount of time it takes to gain consensus and to be able to go from concept and design to actually full implementation can be many years. And so we feel it's important that we keep this going in 2015. And that was what we heard from the work group participants as well. The other important aspect here is we know that the U.S. FDA is responsible for providing some oversight on pilot activity to inform the requirements around item-level traceability. And we know that there's an APEC Business Advisory Council pilot initiative. And we're hoping that the work that we do through the PDSA assessment and the HDMA pilot work could help inform some of the aspects of these pilots that will take place and help us drive that convergence or harmonization that we're looking for. So really, this is an industry call to action, if you will, to continue to stay engaged in this dialogue, to participate in these work efforts going forward to help us move this forward. And so at that point, I will turn it over to Krista to make some final comments, and then we'll open it up for questions, I believe.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So we'd like to let all participants know that the Traceability Data Exchange Architecture white paper will be available on Rx-360's website. It's going to be under the Resources tab. And then also, Lloyd Mager will be presenting more on this topic at the Rx-360 conference, Fighting Fakes, which will be occurring on June 2nd through 3rd. And registration is available at the link that you see on your screen. And then if you also have any further questions or feedback, you can contact Rx-360 at info@rx360.org. And we can also send you the information on the previous slide at that email address. And so with that, I will open up the floor to questions. And as I indicated before, there should be on your panel on the side of your screen a little hand raising icon. So if you just click that, I will see that you have a question, and I will unmute you individually. So let me just see. All right, it doesn't look as though we have any questions right now. So again, if you have any questions down the road for our presenters or for Rx-360, you can see the email address info@rx360.org.
And Krista, this is Rob Welsh. If you go back to slide 21 as you're looking to see if there are questions, I just want to kind of have some follow-up comments on this. So the white paper is posted already, so you will have access. That screenshot that you see is literally from the Rx-360 website, and you could download that, and it's a very detailed, further elaborates on what was presented today by Brian, Lloyd, and Peggy. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. And in addition, as Krista mentioned, Lloyd will kind of not only have an additional presentation, but there'll be robust conversation about this issue at that Fighting the Fakes conference in the first week of June. And there's also a number of other topics that I think many of the attendees to this webinar will find of interest. That full agenda is posted right on the Rx-360 website. So that's available for access. You can look to see who's presenting, and have a good understanding to hopefully for a number of you make plans to be able to participate. I've found it to be a really worthwhile event. So I just want to kind of highlight those two things. So.
Right, and I have received a question. Does the Rx-360 June 2nd through 3rd meeting conflict with GS1 Connect? Do any of you have knowledge to that?
Yes, this is Peggy Staver. It does conflict.
All right, and I've also received a raised hand from, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this, Adwait Badbade. You should be unmuted now. Please feel free to ask your question. And if you've not done so, you'll need to enter your audio pin first, which is #21#.
So Krista, this is Peggy. While we're doing that, could I just add for the GS1 Connect meeting, I'm actually involved with both of these events, the Fighting Fakes with Rx-360 as well as Connect. So even though they conflict, there is a way to participate in both. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to check out the agenda for both meetings and see if you can make it work.
Great, thank you. And I've received a raised hand from Robert Dream. You should be unmuted. Feel free to ask your question. All right, we seem to be having some issues with the hand raising, so if you have any questions, just feel free to send them to me in the questions box. There's a free text box that says questions, and you can send those. So we'll wait a few more minutes for any questions, and then we'll let people go. All right, I've received a question. Although aggregation is not a requirement by all global regulations, how are companies remaining compliant without aggregation?
Hi, this is Lloyd. I will field this question. The markets that require aggregation, we are aggregating product for. We are also, in the case of my company, we're aggregating for business reasons and to make sure that we are getting good at this. The interesting part about the aggregation requirements is they're typically out there saying you need to aggregate, and they don't have a whole lot of requirements around aggregation itself.
Great, thank you, Lloyd. And I've also received another question. The timelines Peggy mentioned for pilots could come after the EU Delegated Act is published. How will that be taken into account?
So this is Peggy. So yes, that's true, it could. But I think that the timing is still appropriate because it allows us to test the various aspects that we noted, some of which may or may not be applicable to the EU. So, for example, the impact of aggregation and inference. Aggregation isn't specifically a requirement in the EU. So, I think we're fine there in terms of the timing. And of course, there's many aspects beyond the aggregation and inference issue as well to be assessed. So, the fact that the delegated act may be published first, I don't believe will adversely impact us in any way, unless I'm missing the point there that the person asking is trying to raise. So please clarify if I've missed something.
All right, I'm going to give 2 more minutes just to see if there's any follow-up questions, and then we will let people go.
Krista, this is Peggy. If I could just say, in terms of the next steps and the path forward, if anyone is interested in participating in these efforts, again, please just reach out directly to Lloyd or Brian or myself. If it's the PDSA work, they could also reach out directly to Levitt Partners. But we could help connect anyone who's interested in remaining engaged in this if they want to contact us.
Great, thank you very much. And I have received one more question. What is the industry readiness on Brazil 2015 requirement? Is everyone able to meet all the ANVISA requirements, or should we come up with an industry standard for ANVISA?
This is Brian. Chris, could you repeat that, please? You were kind of fading out at the end of that. Hello?
Brian, this is Peggy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So what I heard the question to be is, what is industry readiness for compliance with the Brazil requirements, and can we meet all of the requirements there?
Well, I can take a stab at that. My sense of it, certainly from the presentation that we received in the work group activities on Brazil, as well as subsequent events and disclosures there, is that the requirements are still being developed. In terms of industry readiness, I imagine you're probably asking about the pilot for this December. I think that's a company-by-company kind of a thing. I think there are still a lot of people that I'm aware of continually asking questions about what's required, but I think generally people are working towards the pilot. I think in terms of the finished requirements for full implementation for 2016, December of 2016, I think there are still some details probably that need to be added before people really put their compliance efforts together. At least that's my sense.
Great, thank you very much for that. Any final comments from any of our presenters?
This is Rob Welsh. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank everyone who joined the webinar. The recording will be posted on the Rx-360 website in the coming days so that either yourself or you want to have a colleague be able to listen in and get that background. And again, the white paper is already published so that you have access to that information. And then lastly, on behalf of the Rx-360 organization, I want to thank Peggy, Brian, Lloyd, and the entire work group for all the countless hours of efforts putting this together. The intent of Rx-360 was to support the issue of patient safety and provide a forum for these types of efforts, which you've delivered a tremendous deliverable in terms of the white paper and then talking us through this via the webinar. So thank you for all the efforts there. And to follow up on Peggy's comments, if you're interested to get engaged, we really encourage you to reach out as it relates to any of the presenters. You can reach them through the Rx-360 Secretariat, contact information on the website, or if you have any interest in any other supply chain related issues, by all means reach out the same way, and we very much appreciate the engagement, collaboration, and support of the Rx-360 mission of protecting patient safety. So thank you for everyone's time.